Hello and welcome to the Holyrood Sources podcast. We're recording on Wednesday, the 15th of January, and today we're focusing on polling. I'm Calum Macdonald. Welcome to the podcast. Also here, Geoff Aberdein, who was Chief of Staff to the First Minister, Salmond. Hello, Geoff.
Good morning.
And Andy Maciver's with us, who is Director of Communications for the Scottish Conservatives. Hello, Andy.
Good morning.
And if you don't mind both, more importantly than either of you, we have got Professor Sir John Curtis from Strathclyde University here to help us unpack our polling for 2025. John, welcome to the podcast. Great to see you.
Thank you for inviting me. Very kind of you.
It's great to have you on.
We usually would mind Calum, but we'll make a single exception, shall we? That's fine.
Single exception for the Professor. Absolutely rightly. Right, John, let's get straight to it because this poll's already been creating quite a bit of buzz. Shall we start with Holyrood? This is the first Scotland-wide polling of 2025, done for True North Advisors, you'll have heard of them, and the Holyrood Sources podcast by Survation. What, John, do we learn about people's voting intentions ahead of Holyrood 2026?
Well, the answer is that this poll confirms the message of a number of polls before Christmas, which is that the political world of July has long since been left behind. We've got the Labour Party for Holyrood running at 22% on the constituency vote, 21% on the regional vote. That basically means that support for Labour is now running at more or less what it was back at the last Holyrood election back in May 2021. So much for the great revival of the Scottish Labour Party. Not that there has been a dramatic turnaround in the SNP's fortunes. The SNP, 35% on the constituency vote, 31% on the regional vote, are still not running at anything like they were either in 2021 when they got 47% of the constituency vote, or indeed in the 2019 Westminster election when they got 45%. But it's better than the 30% that they got back in July. So who's making progress? Is it the Conservatives? No. Is it the Democrats? Well, no more than modestly. The same can be said of the Greens. Who's making progress? It is Reform, who, again, as a number of other polls have been finding, are now potentially significant players north of the border. 13% on the 13% on both of the two votes, and that's of course well below where Reform are running in British polling at the moment. Indeed, if you take the poll since Christmas, they're running at about 24. So it's still the case that support for a Eurosceptic party of the right is much lower in Scotland than it is elsewhere in the UK. But because Reform broadly are currently as popular as they are given, of course, the Holyrood electoral proportional system, are potentially capable of entering into the next Holyrood Parliament, which on these numbers could be as many as 15 Reform MSPs.
Andy, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think on that latter point, on the Reform point, there's a lot of interesting things in that. One of the most obviously interesting things is that, again, the entry of Reform into the Holyrood marketplace, if you like, it's just all good for the SNP because it's another unionist party that is splitting the unionist vote. John will be able to advise much more on exactly where those votes are coming from. It seems to me before the election they were mostly to Tories, and since the election they've probably mostly been from Labour, but there's not a lot of evidence of them coming from the SNP. So this is just all good news for the SNP because it's yet another unionist party splitting the vote on that side. The interesting thing, I think, from a Reform point of view is they're doing all this without a leader. They have no... I mean, you can't identify... we've had Martin Green on. They have somebody else who has done a fair bit, Helen McDade, I think, if I remember rightly her name is, who's done a fair bit of media. I'm not sure whether either of these people are actually the leader. I'm not sure they have a leader. So they've done all this without really any infrastructure and any leadership, at least any Scottish leadership. But it's still quite a long time to go before the election comes. And I'd be interested in John's reflections on how sticky he thinks that Reform vote actually is, how real that Reform vote actually is, because it's clearly going to have a very material impact on the election and on who forms the government next May.
Well, I make 2 points to make. One is that Reform are pretty heavily milking a niche market. It's a niche market of people who feel that Brexit's a good idea. People are concerned about immigration. That's a niche market across the whole of the UK, but one in which Reform are doing well. So, for example, if you take the most recent British poll, Reform are picking up 50% of those people who voted Leave back in 2016. And that niche market is, however, smaller in Scotland, and therefore, unsurprisingly, Reform are doing less well. But why are they where they are? Well, essentially, they are where they are because, one, we have a Conservative Party that has so far not done much to rehabilitate itself in the eyes of the electorate before its performance at UK government level. We have a Labour government a UK Labour government that has proven a bit of a disappointment. Indeed, one of the clear findings of this poll is that while the public may well indeed be critical of aspects of the SNP's record in government, particularly in respect to the NHS, ask them about the performance of the UK government on the same things, particularly to do with the economy, their evaluations are even worse. So a Labour campaign that in July was very much focused on a plague on both your houses, it's lost one of the crucial stools, or one of the crucial legs upon which that stool rested, which is using Labour as a way of expressing their discontent with the UK government, because yes, they're still discontented with the UK government, but that now means they're discontented with Labour. And that has always then raised the question as to where people would go. Now, a little bit of reversal back to the SNP, but only a bit, because again, the SNP still have their troubles. They still lack the kind of charismatic leadership that they had under both Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon. The Greens, they're not suffering from their involvement in the coalition. They might be in a slightly stronger position in the past, but it's basically steady as you go. And much the same as Liberal Democrats. It is therefore Reform that, in part at least, are simply profiting from the fact that people are scunnered with pretty much all the other alternatives. And while you say they don't have a leader, sure, that Reform did not have a party organisation in July, and they got 15% of the vote. Many of their candidates, particularly in Scotland, were paper candidates, but they still got 7% of the vote. One of the things we now have to watch out for is indeed north of the border. Do we have a Reform Scottish leader? Do they set up a party organisation in each and every constituency? But that is a challenge that Reform now face throughout the UK. It's a challenge they face themselves. They're now trying to convert themselves from the limited company that they technically, legally were still in July to being much more in the way of a conventional party organisation. They know that's the challenge. It's one of the fundamental failures of the Eurosceptic right, ever since the success of UKIP in 2015, to create a permanent party organisation that enables you to put up candidates everywhere whenever there's an election happening. They're now facing up to that challenge. But of course, at the end of the day, my answer to you was, they don't have a Scottish leader. Oh no, sure, they don't. But they do have Nigel Farage. Now, Nigel Farage is controversial, right? And sure, if you look at this opinion poll, you will find twice as many people saying they think of him unfavourably as favourably. But Mr. Farage does have charisma. He can tell a story. He has narrative. He can do narrative. He can do all those things that neither Sir Keir Starmer, on evidence so far, Kemi Badenoch, Ed Davey, or John Sweeney are not very good at doing. And the truth is that for so long as Nigel Farage is a significant part of this, then I think Reform are going to continue to be a potentially disruptive challenger to both the Scottish body politic as well as the wider British body politic.
Let me just give you the Holyrood seat extrapolation, courtesy of John. So the SNP would be on 53, Labour on 24, the Conservatives on 15, Reform on 15, the Lib Dems on 12, and the Scottish Greens on 10 seats at Holyrood. Geoff, what do you make of this voting intention, these numbers ahead of 2026?
Yeah, I think if you went back a year ago and somebody's to tell you that the SNP were leading the Labour Party by double digits, you would have said, not quite right. I think you need to call for the men in white coats. The transformation has been extraordinary. And I'm listening really closely to what John and both Andy say there, and it doesn't sound good, particularly for Labour in this context. Yes, because of the rise of reform. Yes, because of the views of the UK government, which we'll come on to. I suppose my question to John, though, is there anything he sees in this data that should trouble the SNP? When you look at the tables, is there any geographic areas where they're not as strong? Is there any demographics where they're not as wrong? Because I'm struggling to see where things are, how the SNP don't use this platform to go on and win the election.
Well, it depends what you mean by win the election, Geoff, because the crucial thing to realise about these numbers is SNP plus Green, assuming they could patch up. Well, first of all, SNP 53, that is down, 11 on what they achieved back in 2021. It is well short of the 65 needed for a majority. Even if they could reform a relationship with the Greens, it still doesn't quite add up. It's 63. But if we go to the other side of the fence, Labour plus Liberal Democrat, well, that's just 36. Begin to think the unthinkable and add the Tories as at least perhaps silent supporters of all of this. We get ourselves to 51. Crucial thing is, and this is not the first poll to suggest this, is that a possible outcome of this kind of scenario is that it becomes impossible to form either to form a wholly unionist or wholly nationalist government without the acquiescence of reform, or unless we end up with a government which crosses the unionist nationalist divide. And I think, one of the reasons perhaps why Anna Sawar has backed off any threats of bringing down the budget is there's something that's been staring them in the face for quite a while. The truth is, it's in absolutely nobody's interest at Holyrood at the moment to precipitate an early election. Or virtually, certainly the SNP would lose out, the Labour Party would lose out, the Tories would lose out, the Greens wouldn't particularly profit from it, nor the Liberal Democrats. They were all wrapped in a cage which all of them need to remain secure for as long as possible, and that is May 2026. So I think it's already had its impact on Scottish politics. But the point is, government formation in 18 months' time could prove difficult for everybody. Yeah, basically impossible for Anna Sawar, but still potentially difficult for the SNP as well.
Yeah, but on these figures, John, just a quick follow-up. But on these figures, John, if they were to materialise, and we're still worth reminding our listeners, 14 months off here, so there's a lot of water to go under the bridge. But if these figures were to materialise, John Swinney's the next First Minister, absolutely no doubt. There is no other credible alternative. The question I think that's most interesting is how does he choose to govern? And this is where we kind of fall in potentially, Calum, to the coalition discussions, because you did mention there's not a wholly nationalist majority there, but there is an SNP Liberal majority there on these figures, John, 65 seats. And so I think that's perhaps worth consideration.
But that's the point. You have to have a government that crosses the unionist nationalist divide, right?
And I know,
and that would be novel in the 25 years of devolution.
But there's a bit of a foundation for that already. If we go back to when John Swinney brought Kate Forbes into government, the only reason Kate Forbes became Deputy First Minister and that vote was passed by Parliament is because the Lib Dems allowed that to happen. They sat on their hands and allowed Kate Forbes to become Deputy First Minister. We know those two parties have been talking about this year's budget. It's not like there's no foundation whatsoever for a little bit of cross-working between these two parties.
Sure,
they are getting on perfectly well. So, it would be constitutionally strange in the post-referendum environment, but clearly not impossible.
Sure. I acknowledge that. But of course, there's a big difference between the Liberal Democrats persuading the government to put a bit more money into mental health and a bit more money into the island and rural constituencies that some of them represent, and agreeing on a much broader programme for government, including not least, what do you do and say about campaigning for independence for the course of the next 5 years? Because I don't think there is any way, because there will be a Westminster election during the term of the next Scottish government. if we end up with a hung parliament in which, because of an SNP revival north of the border and a weaker Labour Party, the SNP potentially have leverage in a hung parliament, they will not be wanting to stymie their ability to revive the independence debate. And Mr. Cole-Hamilton, on contrast, isn't terribly keen, along with other unionist parties, on anything being done on potentially progressing the argument in favour of independence. So you can see the potential tensions there. But yeah, you're right. But this is the point. We have to begin to think what hitherto we would regard as unthinkable.
It's absolutely fascinating. Right, let's go on to some of the other poll findings, because when it comes to the performance of the UK Labour government, what are we, 6 months in or so since the general election, we asked whether their performance makes it more or less likely that Scottish Labour would become the largest party at Holyrood after the 2026 Scottish elections. And so, John, this is to measure the impact of the UK Labour government's performance on views, perceptions, feelings towards Anas Sarwar and Scottish Labour. And 41% of people say it is less likely. And so we can see within this, and you can break it down further for us, the impact that Sir Keir Starmer is having on Anas Sarwar's electoral chances.
Yeah, to be honest, that's not really the figure from the poll that I pick out for that purpose. You're just simply asking people to be their own psephologists and say, well, what do you think is going to happen to the Labour Party? And some of them at least might have read the odd poll in recent newspapers. The first thing one would pick out is you've got another question there which says people, how well do you think the Labour government has been doing?
Yeah.
And amongst the Scottish public in general, you've only got 20% who think they're doing a reasonably good job, 53% back. But crucially, and this is the point, amongst those people who voted Labour back in July, on balance, the evaluation is negative. It's -5. You've got slightly more people saying, the government for which I voted just 6 months ago, I don't think are doing very well. And you can see the other ways in which you can get at the fact that it's the UK government what does it. If we take evaluations of Sir Keir Starmer amongst people who in Scotland as a whole, he's got evaluations that are not quite as negative as Nigel Farage, but almost, and they're certainly far worse than those of John Swinney. John Swinney actually comes out as now reasonably evenly balanced. But again, amongst those people who voted Labour in July, evaluations of Sir Keir Starmer are not that favourable. Sir Keir Starmer is certainly not as favourably evaluated by those who voted Labour in July as Kemi Badenoch is amongst those who voted Conservative, or Sir Ed Davey is amongst those who voted Liberal Democrat, let alone Nigel Farage amongst those who voted for reform. So that's point one. You can see that Sir Keir Starmer's relative unpopularity is dragging Labour down. You can see that Labour's overall performance in office is clearly one that is not favourably evaluated by those who voted Labour. And then you've got a number of detailed questions about economic growth, about living standards, about income tax. And amongst those people who voted Labour in 2024, on all of these, we've got negative evaluations, some of them heavily negative. So, for example, on economic growth, 26% think they've been doing well, 41% think they've been doing badly. These are Labour voters. On people's living standards for those on low income, 21% well, 51% worse. Now, the SNP's figures on the equivalent questions are not brilliant, but at least those people who voted for the SNP back in the last Holyrood election are on balance thinking favourably about the SNP's record. So again, it gives you another idea as to how basically, the worst thing this was always a risk. I can well remember a lot of the talk immediately after July saying, Anas Sarwar is clearly heading to be the next first minister. One someone went, you know what? The first rule of politics is that it's usually a disadvantage to be fighting a midterm election when your party is in government. We are talking about a Labour government that's got despite its large parliamentary majority, got a relatively low level of support, 35% across Great Britain as a whole. Now, true, it's a UK Labour government that has hit electoral trouble more rapidly than I think certainly any government since the 1970s. And we couldn't necessarily have anticipated that, but I think there was always a risk that by 2026, the thing that was most likely to scupper Anas Sarwar's chances of becoming First Minister was the fact that Sir Keir Starmer had managed to win the election.
But this is the point, though, isn't it? And it's not a point that anything can be done about in the next year, but it's a really existential point for unionist parties to consider. Because none of this is Anas Sarwar's fault. Just like in 2011, when Tavish Scott lost 2/3 of his seats and half his vote, that wasn't Tavish Scott's fault. That's because his party had gone into coalition with the Tories at Westminster, and I think probably, John, because of tuition fees more than anything else.
Absolutely.
The Lib Dem vote collapsed in Scotland. My point is, you can't outrun what your party at Westminster is doing. You can't do it. So if you're in charge of a Holyrood party, unlike John Swinney, he controls the destiny of the SNP. He controls his own destiny. Anas Sarwar's not in charge of his own destiny. Keir Starmer is. Tavish Scott wasn't in charge of his destiny in 2011. And no Tory leader ever has been in charge of their destiny.
All absolutely true up to a point, and certainly, very difficult to swim against the tide. But I guess the exception to the rule is the Conservative Party under Ruth Davidson. Ruth Davidson did manage to turn things around north of the border in a way that that you wouldn't necessarily have anticipated.
Only post-referendum, though, John.
But the point
in
is,
2015, she got the lowest vote share ever for a Tory leader at a general election.
Yeah, sure. But the point is, in the Holyrood election of 2016, she managed to get into second place, etc., etc. And I think the point is that, it is very difficult. But the one thing that Ruth Davidson had is she had a degree of personal popularity. She had ability to reach the wider electorate. And the truth is that while Anas Sarwar is not particularly unpopular, he's not particularly popular either. There isn't very much there in the way of a magnet from him to counteract the negative poll that's coming from Sir Keir Starmer. And, so it's undoubtedly a difficult job for a unionist party that's in government, but not necessarily for unionist parties that are in opposition. But I think the point is that so far it's not entirely clear that Scottish Labour have made much sense. Now, of course, what's also true, what we should remember here, and again, there was a lot of myth created about the revival of the Labour Party north of the border. The revival of the Labour Party north of the border dates from December 2021. What happened in December 2021? We got the first stories about Partygate. That was the date from which the UK Labour government positions have been managed to revive. At what point did the Scottish Labour Party reach about 30%? Was it when Nicola Sturgeon resigned? No, it wasn't. It was when Liz Truss resigned. It was the Liz Truss fiscal event that was the second foundation of all this. Now, it's true that then thereafter, the difficulties that the SNP encountered in the wake of Nicola Sturgeon's resignation and the somewhat unfortunate election of Humza Yousaf and his administration, the SNP then did begin to get into a segment of SNP support. But that was very much the third leg of the Scottish Labour revival. Now, although the Conservatives have not been forgiven for Partygate or Liz Truss, but all of that advantage is being counteracted by, as we've been saying, people's evaluation of the Labour Party North Border. So it is always clear that the revival of the Scottish Labour Party was more dependent on what was going on at Westminster than what had necessarily been going on in Holyrood and the SNP. Dramatic though and difficult though the position of the SNP had been in the 18 months leading up to the July election.
Geoff?
Just a quick observation. It becomes whose analysis do I trust to go through the numbers here? Andy, I'm going to go with John on this one. So good luck to you.
Outrageous.
And John,
Why?
John, you said something really interesting a couple of minutes ago about the performance of both governments and the views of SNP voters about the Scottish Government and Labour voters on the Labour Government. And I actually think that's really, really important because the framing of this election is all that matters, And in my sense, we know what Anas Sarwar's stick's going to be. He's going to have to go. His only route's going to have to go on criticising the Scottish Government for their record.
Yep.
Whereas I believe if John Swinney, and I said this on the podcast with him last week, if you can present this as, we know we've got work to do and we can be better, but you can trust us to stand up for Scotland's interests, then I think that they will do well. And that's why we asked that question on who do you trust to stand up for Scotland's interests? And the SNP are on 33%, Labour way behind on 16%. So we can now see the bones of how this election is going to be fought, I believe. And I think, again, on these numbers, it can only be good for the SNP in that respect.
Sure. I mean, that sense of standing up for Scotland's interests has always been one of the SNP's advantages.
Sure.
But in a sense, Geoff, I mean, on this podcast, we should attempt to be honest, and we should attempt to be honest in a way that neither the SNP nor the Labour Party are honest. The honest truth is that both governments face more or less the same problem.
Yep.
That is a flatlining economy, public services that do not work, and severe fiscal constraint, right? That's the problem that both of them face. And to that extent, at least, it's going to be also a blame game, is who devoted... I mean, things may turn around. Now, if things turn around as a result of, and people are persuaded that as a result of the actions of the UK government, because the UK economy gets better, that reduces some of the fiscal constraint, and the health service, at least down south of the border, is beginning to improve. Then it may well be that Labour's fortunes will revive both north and south of the border. But if things are still bad, it's going to be about who do voters blame. And now, the SNP certainly have to worry about the health service. The evaluation in your poll where on balance, those who voted the SNP in 2021 are only just marginally favourable in their evaluation. 38 to 35 is the NHS. On other criteria, they're doing much better. So I think at minimum, the SNP need to turn around whatever progress is made south of the border in turning around the health service, and particularly its waiting lists, its waiting times that matters. The SNP need to make at least as much progress, and at the moment we're not entirely sure whether either government really have a clear idea about how to achieve this and have the resources and strategy to do it, but we will wait and see. But it will be a question of, it's about the framing. It's about whose fault is the mess if we are indeed still in the mess. Now, the truth is that does potentially create an opportunity to reform. It ought to create an opportunity for the Conservatives. But, of course, nobody knows who Russell Findlay is. Sorry, Andy. And equally...
you don't have to apologise to me.
Kemi Badenoch does not seem to be interested in the early elections that are going to take place in this parliament. She's decided she's going to play a long game. She's interested in trying to get her party sorted by 2029. She's going to have this consultation process that presumably in the end is going to come up with the answers that she wants it to come up with. But it's not into... And in particular, the thing that Kemi Badenoch doesn't seem to understand, like many Conservatives, is that they're going to find it very, very difficult to get purchase with the electorate until they, A, distance themselves from Boris Johnson, and B, admit that Liz Truss fouled up. They've begun to do a little bit of the latter, but they're still deeply reluctant to distance themselves from Boris Johnson. And at the end, the Tories, too many Tories out there still think that the reason why people voted against us is because they presided over an expansion of the record expansion of the state and record levels of immigration. No. And we weren't true to ourselves. No, that's not the problem. The problem is not that they weren't true to themselves. The problem is that the public doubt their integrity and their competence. And until that is turned around, they will struggle to recover whatever the difficulty of the UK and Scottish governments.
And just a very brief point on that. Of course, Russell Findlay and Kemi Badenoch, I think, have a lot in common in that both of them are effectively tacking towards that sort of populist, common sense reform vote. I mean, they are misdiagnosing. If that's your diagnosis of the problem, John, they're misdiagnosing that completely. But can I just go back to one thing? I think, I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of Anas Sarwar listening to this podcast. Not a lot of, from what you're saying, John, there's not a lot of good news for him in that actually there's a sense, I think, of helplessness there, right? There's really nothing he can do about what's going on here. Is that correct?
Sorry, John, can I just add to that point? Because I think it's so relevant to what we heard yesterday from Rachel Reeves, saying nothing's off the table in terms of further cuts and as the SNP and others will describe, austerity and all the rest of it. So this is the question I really want to know. In your view, John, what route is there for Anas Sarwar to regain the momentum he once had? I just can't see it in the data, and I'm hoping you can maybe shed a light on where it potentially might come from.
Sure. No, it is undoubtedly very, very difficult. But the honest answer is, I mean, the question I would pose to you, so give me 3 sentences that outline your understanding of Anas Sarwar's vision for Scotland in 2035.
Anyone?
Right.
Okay,
There is no story, right?
Even if he did have one, John, would it make a difference?
Sir Keir Starmer does not have a story, right?
Yeah.
And this is crucial. You need, particularly once you are in government, you've got to give people a sense that you've got a sense of direction in which you're going, a set of objectives you're trying to achieve. Sir Keir Starmer, at the end of the day, is a technocrat. He is somebody who believes that if we get things right, the public will say thank you very much, without realizing you not only have to deliver, you have to persuade people that you have delivered. And those two things don't necessarily go together. And I think the honest truth is that Anas Sarwar doesn't seem, it's a rare ability, right? But doesn't seem to have that ability to be able to allow vision. Now, the truth is, I would make the same criticism of John Swinney, right? John Swinney has steadied the ship. Okay, we can kind of go, right, experienced politician, more or less managed to unite his party. The internal faction fighting has largely gone away, not entirely, but largely. He's politically certainly much more astute on a day-to-day tactical basis. See the budget, but John Swinney is still not a charismatic politician. He is still not somebody who's going to set the heather on fire. And to that extent, at least, that it's also a problem for the SNP. It's just that the SNP at the end of the day can always try to play the tartan card.
Which, Calum, I think brings us neatly to a potential future leader for the SNP.
Well, yes, so we threw this question in here. Who is your preferred candidate for leader of the SNP following John Swinney? Now, this is obviously with the proviso that he was out last weekend saying that should the SNP win in 2026, his intention is to stay on. So that's the kind of, real...
They all say that, Calum.
Yeah, that's just the right thing to say, isn't it? But that's what he had to say. So who's your preferred candidate? Kate Forbes, 25%. Stephen Flynn, 13%. Then Mary McCallan, Jenny Gilruth, Neil Gray, they're all on kind of 4 or 3%, and someone else on 1%. In fairness, don't know is 50%. But Kate Forbes is up there on 25%, John. So does this speak to Kate Forbes' perennial problem with SNP leadership ambitions, that Scotland likes the idea of her, the SNP doesn't?
Absolutely spot on, because the other number you need to pick up from the poll is what are the views of SNP supporters. Not that Kate Forbes is doing badly, 24. Stephen Flynn, 26. We saw this when she was engaged in the battle with Humza Yousaf. She was undoubtedly more popular amongst non-SNP supporters than she was amongst SNP supporters, although at the end of the day, despite the fact that virtually every SNP parliamentarian, both in London and in Edinburgh, who went public, came out in favour of Humza Yousaf, he only just won, and that was the moment you knew that his leadership was on a bit of a sugary peg. But it's still the case that clearly there is a section of the SNP, for a variety of reasons, but no doubtless, at least in part, Miss Forbes still relatively social conservative views, and of course the fact that, shall we say, she was probably closer to Alex Salmond than Nicola Sturgeon in terms of her views of the economy of Scotland. That this means that she is not as popular amongst SNP supporters. So, if John Swinney does decide that what will be second or third time around he is going to hang his boots up, she may well find that winning the leadership will not necessarily be that straightforward, and that despite the fact that, shall we say, Mr. Flynn somewhat blotted his copybook with his attempts to run for both Westminster and Holyrood at the same time, there still might be a serious competition between them. And I think, I'm speaking as a non-SNP person, I think in a sense the SNP are lucky in that they do have two people who, in terms of ability to make a speech, ability to reach out to the wider public, to be combative politicians, are at least potentially heirs of the kind that they had with both Salmond and Sturgeon. But the battle between them could still be a fairly fierce one.
And John, very quick follow-up for me on that, because I think that's a really, really interesting point. Going back to Kate Forbes' decision not to stand against John Swinney, clearly the data would suggest that was the right decision, because she wouldn't have won against John Swinney. But do you think it was the right thing for her to go into government to try and reduce that deficit with her own party's voters? Because if you remember the Hamza Yusuf contest, and I can't remember the exact date, I'm sure you will, but I thought the gap between them was much larger than just the 2% with Stephen Flynn. So clearly being in government is a longer term game for her to try and ingratiate herself with SNP voters.
Yeah, sure. And of course, it's I mean, the truth is that as it were, those associated with and close to Kate Forbes were pretty much heavily engaging in a rather difficult briefing campaign against Hamza Yusuf for quite some time. And there were people like Fergus Earing and Michelle Thompson who journalists could ring up and they could always get a quote as it was critical. And all of a sudden, seemingly for the most part, those phone calls are no longer being answered. And sure, yes, I suspect. I mean, it's clearly, I think, to our advantage to be operating in government, to be seen to being loyal, while at the same time, I mean, on the one hand, she's serving under a First Minister whose principal big objective is the reduction of child poverty. Now, this is a really very substantial challenge, and it's not exactly a challenge that's associated with somebody on the centre-right like Kate Forbes. But evidently, Miss Forbes reckons she could at least do enough for Scottish business within the framework of what the First Minister thinks is his principal objective. So, yeah, sure. I mean, I think she's. Well, I think the point is she's probably in a stronger position now than she was 12 months ago. But Stephen Flynn, despite his difficulties, and depending on where he is, but I think a lot of people would have said that in the last Westminster Parliament, the person who was best at PMQs was Stephen Flynn.
John, thank you very much. We really, really value your time. Thank you for coming on the podcast.
You're welcome.
Cheers.